Let me now join in the celebratory chorus for our colleague, Alan Wolfe. We arrived here at Boston College within a year of each other in the late 1990s, and one of the great pleasures of my own time here at the university has been getting to know Alan as a colleague and to watch his own never-ending evolution as teacher, as university citizen, as intellectual. He's brought remarkable energy and imagination to his nearly 20 years on campus and at the Boisi Center, and will leave this university a far more interesting place for his presence and his leadership. This afternoon's panel is meant, in the great Jesuit tradition, to be a conversation about ideas and values, about the personal and the political, about, given the title, the calling of the public intellectual. We're thrilled on this occasion to have two of this era's most important public-minded thinkers with us. Howard Gardner is the John H. and Elisabeth A. Hobbs Professor of Cognition and Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He also holds positions as Adjunct Professor of Psychology at Harvard and Senior Director of Harvard's Project Zero. Among numerous honors, Gardner received a MacArthur Prize Fellowship in 1981, and he has received honorary degrees, it's at last count that I have, from 30 colleges and universities around the world. He has twice been selected, first by Foreign Policy and then by Prospect Magazine, as one of the 100 most influential public intellectuals in the world. The author of 30 books, translated into 32 languages and several hundred articles, Gardner is best known in educational circles for his theory of multiple intelligences. Alan Wolfe is Professor of Political Science and Director of the Boisi Center for Religion and American Public Life here at BC. The author and editor of more than 20 books, including most recently At Home in Exile, Why Diaspora is Good for the Jews, Political Evil, What It Is, and How to Combat It, and The Future of Liberalism. A contributing editor, among other journals, the Wilson Quarterly, Commonwealth Magazine, and in character, Professor Wolfe writes for these publications as well as for Commonweal, the New York Times, Harper's, the Atlantic Monthly, the Washington Post, and countless other magazines and newspapers. Alan served as an advisor to President Clinton in preparation for the 1995 State of the Union address and has lectured widely at American and European universities. From this provost's perspective, Alan has helped this university, and so much more, our nation's public culture, grapple more seriously with the persistence of faith in our politics, and his voice has insisted over decades and across a mind-boggling range of fora and platforms on the ethical obligation for serious scholars of American life to engage beyond the academy with our fellow citizens across the nation, across ideological divides, and across faith traditions. My job now is to get out of the way. Our speakers will field questions later in the session, and we'll hope to wrap up just after 2 p.m. We hope many of you will be able to join us for a reception later this afternoon at the Boisi Center on Quincy Road. My colleague Eric Owens will conclude this session by giving you a little bit of logistical information at that point. It's now my great pleasure to turn the microphone over to Professors Gardner and Wolfe.
Thank you, David. Good afternoon, everybody. Am I audible?
Am I?
Yes. That's all that's important. Anyway, it's been an excellent day. Colleagues of Alan's speaking about religion, about the calling of the public intellectual. Not all of you were here, so I right away faced the question about whether we can build on that knowledge or be a blank slate. And I made a unilateral decision to assume that not everybody was here this morning, and it's up to Alan whether he wants to refer to the issues that came up. I imagine that you must have had 1,000 thoughts of your friends and colleagues for reflecting on those issues. Alan and I have known each other for some time, socially as well as on paper, and I guess I would say that he's one of the very few people who are alive that when I see his name as a byline, I want to read what it is that he said. Sometimes the topic is not at all predictable. I would not have thought that Alan would write a long essay in Frank Holloway's book about firstborn versus secondborn kids, but here he is, having things to say which I would not have thought of. And I guess, speaking honestly, I often agree with him, and we like to read people with whom we feel a kind of kinship, whether that's because we're the same age and both came from Pennsylvania, leave social intellectual historians. But what's really interesting about a writer, a public intellectual, is when you want to read them, even when you don't find yourself in agreement, because you know you're going to be provoked and learn something, maybe even change your mind. And so, even though he's no longer going to be officially professing, I think everybody in this room looks forward to what you're going to say and what you're going to write. The public intellectual, as we learned in the last session, doesn't need to have an official paid position. So wherever you are, what's on your mind will be of interest to many, many people. I ran a few questions by Alan beforehand, and he said, well, ask what you want. So I'm going to do that, and as I said later, we'll turn it over to people who may want to pursue a particular line. So people wouldn't be here unless they had some sense of what a public intellectual is. And you may not all know this, but there's a book called The Intellectual Republic, and the author is Alan Wolfe, and it's a collection of many of his essays. But I thought I'd like saying, if you met a 10-year-old, let's say my grandson Oscar, who's kind of a curious kid, and you said, Professor Wolfe, or Dr. Wolfe, what is it that you do? How would you answer that question for Oscar?
Well, first, let me just, this is an incredible lecture, it's just an amazing, and I thank you all so much for coming, and Susan, Dan, and quickly, and Eric, all the work, and all the students, it just, what can I say, not only made my day, made my year, made my decade. Well, that's a great question. Maybe you could wait 9.5 years, 9 3/4 years, and ask me again, because in 9 3/4 years, my 3-month-old grandchild will be asking me the very same question, and I'll come away with an answer for Maya, who's there. So what do you tell us? I think if the morning session was talking about the role of ideas in American culture, if Ramsey Kennedy's happy mood and optimism about the future of the intellectual life is something that actually happens to us, I will explain to your 10-year-old grandson about ideas and why ideas matter. Every sign that I can see now about our public culture as reflected in this election that's going on and so on suggests that ideas are in a very, very precarious state at the moment. We heard a lot of discussion about that this morning. So my sense is that people who deal in ideas do very, very valuable and important work, and that you will have to explain that to the younger generation and have to probably take a historical approach. And, because as a 10-year-old enters into learning about the world and learning about politics, my sense, given the way this country is going at the moment, is it won't be the happiest of subjects, and I would like to put a little more, like Professor Kennedy, a little more positive spin on this thing we do here.
Well, I was there at the earlier panel, and one thing that struck me about the discussion was that it seemed to be very U.S.-centric. To what extent do you think that the imperiledness of ideas is something that we're dealing with, particularly in the U.S. at this time, as opposed to a more global phenomenon? And just to make this vivid, I was interested that the name of the person who was by far the most prominent public intellectual in the world was not mentioned, Noam Chomsky.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I'm going to mention him this afternoon when I talk about the role that my high school played in my development, because Noam Chomsky and I went to the same high school. He was in the same class with Hillary Putnam, the recently deceased professor of philosophy at Harvard. So I was going to mention him. I think that the situation that we've been discussing today about ideas and all of that can't be separated from the fact that this country, and I think Europe as well, and probably the whole world, has just become far more fearful. And it's this fear of the stranger, fear of economic, whatever it is, that just seems to be that when fear comes to dominate the public sector, the first thing to seek is protection. And the one thing that ideas are probably bad at giving is protection. I mean, we don't do ideas to feel more secure and to feel more safe. So the whole tenor of public conversation at the moment is premised upon emotions that just run contrary to the nature of the business we're in. In that sense, I wouldn't say that there's much difference between what's going on here and what's going on in other countries. I don't know other countries as well as I should. The only foreign language I speak is spoken only by 5 million people in the world, and that's the country of which Copenhagen is the capital. And this is a country known for its liberalism, known for its tolerance, at the moment being dominated by xenophobic, anti-intellectual political parties, probably become the most hostile to Muslims in all of Europe, if not the only possible exception being the other great liberal paradise in Europe, Holland, which has also become excessively. So, when I hear some of the talk that's going on about these fears, and especially about the fear of Muslim others and terrorism and foreigners, we are by no means alone.
Now, 10-year-old Oscar or Maya would say, but there are plenty of ideas. I mean, this guy Trump and Cruz and Sanders, they're filled with ideas. So what do you mean when you talk about the peril of ideas?
Who'd ever thought we'd have a man running for president named after the cross? That's got to be a mark in our history in some way or another. You've got to, I think, really understand the difference between slogans and ideas. And how do you get that knowledge? How do you get to be able to differentiate? The whole premise of our educational system is to ask people to think deeper about these kinds of things and not just to sloganize. I'm sure someone has written a book called The Sloganization of the United States.
And like most books, all you have to do is read the title.
Right.
You don't have to read the book.
And like most books, a lot of people buy it but never read it. I don't know if you've had that experience. By the way, this is meant to be, he's not interviewing me. This is meant to be a conversation between the two of us.
Sure.
So, I can turn any question he asks that I can't think of an immediate and clever answer back to him and say, well, Howard, what do you think about it?
All right, fair enough. There are no explicit ground rules for this. But building again on what Randy Kennedy said, I'm not as optimistic about the university in the way that you and he are talking about it. The second question I was going to ask you, and I think I told you this, I'll give a little context for, is how would you describe what you're doing to somebody who is a quintessential STEM person? And for those of you who are lucky enough not to know what STEM is, it's science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And I talked to a wonderful Harvard freshman a few years ago, and he said something to me which I'd never heard before, but I now realize that it's very dominant, even at a place like Harvard, which wouldn't think of itself that way. This freshman said to me, I'm not interested in questions for which there are no answers. And I mean, he said it sincerely, and I was kind of shocked, and I tried to figure out how to engage in it. But can you talk a bit about disciplines and expertise and those areas which in many of the more fragile parts of the world people retreat into because they can't, they can't be attacked for mathematics the way they can for doing political science?
Well, that's a big question. This year is 50th anniversary of an awful lot of things. But for me in particular, in my interests, it's the 50th anniversary of the creation by Congress of an organization called the National Institute for the Humanities, the National Endowment for the Humanities. And I was asked by people there earlier this year to speak in honor of the creation of the NEH at another Jesuit institution known as Loyola University in Baltimore. You know, we had panel discussions, you know, like we do here. And this was at the heart of what we were doing. You know, why do we do the humanities? What are the results we expect from the humanities? What makes us different from the STEM disciplines, and so on. I could not, everybody has people that have influenced them intellectually. We heard a lot this morning about John Rawls and so on. Whenever I approach a new problem, the first thinker who comes to mind for me was a Latvian-born philosopher who later moved to England named Isaiah Berlin, and wrote extensively on the meaning of the good life and how we think about the good life. And Isaiah Berlin's main point, I think, is to distrust any monocausal or distrust any one vision of the good life, and to encourage us to think in plural terms, that there are many ways to lead a good life. There are many ways to, it's not the kind of academic relativism that there are many truths that we find in the postmodern tendencies within the academy, but it's, for me, a very, very essential definition of what it means to be a liberal and what it means to think in liberal terms, not liberal, you know, in the context of American politics, but more generally in intellectual history. And so I've always been attracted to this notion that there are a plurality of goods, there are a plurality of ways to reach those goods. I think the university as an intellectual and academic institution ought to reflect that kind of plurality. STEM ways of thinking do not. There is one method, it's a scientific method, it's pursued in one way, its results are publishable in one way, and so on. And it's become, in the course of my academic career, moved from being one way of thinking about knowledge and how to create it to the only legitimate way of knowledge and how it's created. And so when the NEH said, you know, to me, if you were thinking of new programs that we could, you know, think about and fund, what would you advocate? And I thought it would be a very, very good idea to have a program in which scientists learn about humanistic methods of inquiry and what they're about and where they're headed and so on. Because all too often in the university today, I see people from humanistic differences being promoted by their departments for tenure, and then it comes to a university-wide committee that has to pass on that. And then the first question is, how many articles, not how many books, how many of them are referee journals, how many of them conform to this one particular mode of inquiry. So my first talking to a STEM person would be to try to persuade or otherwise encourage this idea of a multiplicity. I enormously respect the STEM model of how to accumulate and disseminate knowledge. I think its advances, it's miraculous how good, but please respect mine as well, because we have different objectives. And mine necessarily, they are united by the fact that they require a university environment to flourish, but they're different in their methodology.
Have you ever done the experiment of sitting down with a colleague in kind of a narrow STEMI and have them read Isaiah Berlin and engage them in discussions?
One.
better than my batting average.
Little Maya's mother is an assistant professor of chemistry at Johns Hopkins University. I don't know how she became a chemist. It's not like as her father, I said, why don't you become a chemist? You know, nothing like that. But yeah, so I raised that child. And no doubt she's on her way to the Nobel Prize. It's just a question of a few years. Yeah.
One thought I had this morning for the people who were on that second panel, there was an unfortunate, I thought, inflation between what's the noun I want? Merging between science and technology. I think that what the American public wants, and maybe publics elsewhere, is basically technology. And it's the atomic bomb and the Salk vaccine. And if we have to go through science, it's a necessary evil. And thinking about Chomsky, he actually got money from the government in the 50s and 60s because it was machine translation, so we could figure out what the bad guys were doing. I guess I would say that what humanists and scientists are doing when they broach new areas is not that dissimilar from one another. But once you move into the applications, that's where I think the division occurs. Where I did think the panel was onto something is that there was more, experts didn't become the whipping boy for as much part of the population 50 years ago as today. And what are your thoughts?
What are yours? Told you. You can't say I didn't give you a warning.
I mean, all right, well, I'll bring up what some other people brought up, the social media and also reality TV. Hofstadter wasn't mentioned today, Richard Hofstadter, but everybody was thinking, I'm sure, about the anti-intellectual strain in American life. It's been there all the time. As you just said, probably when people are fearful, 1890s, the 1950s, it flares up, and then when we're doing well economically and the bad guys are not, it gets reduced. But nowadays, not only do we have not three networks, as old people here will remember on TV. I always like to quote Walter Cronkite, I think you all know who he was, who used to end his newscast with a statement, and that's the way it is. Right. And then there was a guy next to him named Eric Severide who would explain it to you if you didn't really understand the way it is. And now, there's just cacophony. And as Bill Galston was saying, when you add that to social media, the notion that there's anybody who can seem to be above the fray, or as you were alluding to, who doesn't cite God as the only source in the references, is already suspect. And Bill said, I don't know whether we can ever return to a more gatekeeping kind of world. I don't either, though I think, if anything, from a personal point of view, I more need gatekeepers now than ever before. And the biggest question I ask is it by Alan Wolfe? Because he's not going to sell me a particular bill of goods, just to get me to read. But that may just be as somebody else said, was it a triumph of hope over experience, the Samuel John. So you mentioned Isaiah Berlin. Were there other people, either historical or contemporary, who you think were quite formative, not only in what you thought, but also in the way that you thought about it? And I will confess something here, which probably nobody knows except my wife Ellen, who's here. My hero in college was Edmund Wilson. Edmund Wilson was Susan Jacoby, is that how it's pronounced? Jacoby. Oh, so I was right the first time. Edmund Wilson never had a job. He just wrote. He wrote for different magazines, and I was delighted in what he wrote about, which is almost everything and how he wrote about it. And that had a big influence on me, though I certainly never became an Edmund Wilson. In fact, I'll add one other interesting thing. I invited him to come to speak at Quincy House 50 years ago, and I got one of these notes from Edmund Wilson, which says, Edmund Wilson regrets he's unable to, and there were like 10 things, and he checked what it was. But I had saved the envelope, and one of the wonderful things about online, I was able to look up his handwriting, and he actually had addressed the thing himself, because he probably didn't have a secretary, from Wellfleet, where he was in the 60s. So what other people, either teachers or writers, besides Berlin, you think were formative in your thinking or in how you write?
Well, if I may, the last time I had dinner with Howard and with Ellen at their house, one of the fellow guests for dinner was a sociologist, also a professor at Harvard named Nathan Glaser. Nat Glaser to me, just embodied everything there was about the line of business that I chose to take. He came from a non-traditional academic background, background in journalism, a background in Jewish life and Jewish affairs. He wrote about all the great issues of the time: ethnicity, race, multiculturalism. When he said that we were all multiculturalists now, he was paraphrasing President Nixon with his Keynesian remark. Nat Glaser is an extraordinary man. I know that you were planning to pick him up and bring him here today, but he just finally couldn't make it. Please tell him how I spoke about him in this room.
Thank you.
Because it really, really means a lot to me. And he was part of a generation of scholar intellectuals, whatever you want to call them: Daniel Bell at Harvard, Seymour Martin Lipset at Berkeley and Columbia. These were people who did very, very serious academic work, but they presented it to the general public. If it weren't for all of them, I never would have gone into the academic business. I was assigned their books in college. I had a professor. What did I know about professors at the time? I thought so much of this guy and the books he assigned that I tried to track him down, and he's just disappeared from the face of the earth. And he didn't obviously get tenure, and I didn't even know if he was on a regular line that led to tenure. But in that brief 6 months where I sat in his class and read those books, I knew exactly what I wanted to be. I mean, how would I come to know what I want to be anyway? I grew up in this neighborhood in Philadelphia where we were all children of immigrants or grandchildren of immigrants, and we all came from families where our parents, my father was a high school dropout and went into a construction firm with his three brothers and his father, Wolfe Construction Company. I'd say look it up, but probably doesn't exist anywhere on the web. And so I go to a commuter school, Temple University, where you can get there by subway, and I walk into this room, and this guy's talking about the end of ideology. I knew what the meant, I knew what end meant. Wasn't sure I knew what ideology meant. And all of a sudden, I'm a public intellectual. So we do follow in the footsteps of people, and I was so incredibly naive at the time. I thought that these people who wrote these books were just giants of their field. Only later did I learn how marginalized they were in their own universities and so on. But it was just, Nat Glaser is the very embodiment.
Wonderful. And this touches on the stories that Susan was telling, speaking at places we haven't even heard of, and having kids who wanted to know what she was reading and how they could pursue their own intellectual path. Are there subjects that you don't write about, and why?
Well, I love music, and especially opera. I've never written about it. I don't know why. I just absolutely don't know why. I don't think it's a question of being totally unqualified, because I do know an awful lot about it, and I have very strong tastes and so on. But it's a good question. Why,
Yeah,
why would I never do that?
let me, while you're thinking about other areas, I, like you, am quite involved in music. It's next to my family. It's the most important thing for me. I have basically not written about it either. I started to write a book about Mozart.
There is musical intelligence.
Yeah. I started to write a book about Mozart, and I decided I had nothing to say about him that wasn't said before. And that may be an interesting, this is a sort of thing that people might look at empirically. Maybe part about writing is wanting to write about something that you don't know as much about, and you can chart your own learning. Even though I'm not very visual, almost all my arts writing has been about the visual arts. I didn't feel that I was thinning what needed to be said in order to say it. With music, I felt like it's almost like writing about your family.
But you play, right?
I have resumed playing, actually. Yes. How about you?
I'm a total klutz, a technical term.
Yeah, Ellen has to hear me do my art this morning. I don't know if you heard me. I was doing my Czerny this morning, which was the most painful. These are exercises for the
Czerny with a Z, right?
Right.
See, I know enough about music to know that there's a Z in Czerny.
Are there other things that that you wish you had written about and you haven't yet? Either topics or people or parts of the world. For example, the diaspora book was not something I assumed you had not been thinking about 30 years ago. Maybe
No,
I'm
no,
wrong.
not at all.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, a couple of my friends who are Jewish and spent their entire lives writing about secularism started talking about, well, is it time to write the Jewish book? In fact, just the other day I got an email.
It's better than the Jewish problem, right? Or
Right.
the Jewish question. Yeah.
I got an email from a friend who used to write for the New Republic, whose name's John Judas. We've known each other and not Judas, not that Judas.
With an I, right?
Judas
Not with a Z, but with an I.
And he said, how's your Jewish book doing? John Judas had also turned and written his Jewish book. Eric Alterman, another friend of mine in New York who writes for The Nation, has just written his Jewish book. So I thought I was just, let me write a book about the diaspora. In turn, I didn't know it was a stage in the life cycle. That you're the psychologist. You should have warned me,
This has just been tweeted. A serious issue, which I'm sure you have been asked before, what are the areas where you have really changed your mind and why? And what are the through lines where, Alan Wolfe today is not much different in how you thought decades ago?
I was actually going to say something about that within Nat Glaser. And Nat Glaser was at various times called a neoconservative at various times. The first thing I ever encountered by him was things he wrote when he was on the faculty at Berkeley and were written in response to the 1964 events at Berkeley. I would have to say that in 1964, when I was a certain age, when I was 22, I was totally on the side of the student movement at Berkeley and Clark Kerr and the all that stuff resonated with me. A guy like Glaser, would have been the enemy. Susan Jacoby said some very nice things about how I once told her that I changed my mind about a negative review of a book I once wrote of hers. I actually once wrote an article, no one remembers it, and it was published in The Nation when I was then on its editorial board, in which I apologized to Seymour Martin Lipset and Daniel Bell and all those people and said, I had you wrong. I now see with a little more graying of the temples or whatever what your concerns were. So nowadays, when I hear about, all the latest movements, well, let me put it this way. I can't stand Bernie Sanders. I just can't stand him. His voice drives me. I'd rather listen to Donald Trump than to Bernie Sanders. Yes, I would. People tell me every time Trump comes on the television, they turn it off. Every time Bernie Sanders. Now, this is a guy who's a little older than me by about 6 months, and whose politics, I was probably to the left. I was probably far to the left of Bernie Sanders, and I've changed, and I have to pull my hair out that he won't change, and he keeps saying the same goddamn thing over and over again, and he may believe it's true, but it never was, for Christ's sake.
Well, my wife is going to ask me what you meant, so I'm going to ask you, what are the things about Sanders that you find, other than the way everybody talks very loudly, what are the things that make you alienated from him?
Well, here I have to be careful of borderline anti-Semitism and having your remarks interpreted the wrong way. So I won't say anything about hands, and I won't say anything about accents. No, it's it's the basic economic message that has a certain resonance. I don't necessarily. Let me put it this way. I couldn't agree more than that the fact that the growing gap between rich and poor in this country is the single greatest moral problem of our era and should be treated as a moral problem. It's an absolute disgrace, and it must be at the heart of any election campaign. So in that sense, but as a great lover of music, my all-time favorite libretto writer was Lorenz Hart. And
Not Lorenz
Rodgers and Hart, and Johnny One Note is one of their songs, and this is just Johnny One Note. You've got to have a foreign policy. You've got to, well, it really reflects back to the question. I don't see any reflection in the way he talks, any reflection at all. Hillary Clinton, well, we're not here to talk about politics, but let me just say briefly, I admire her enormously and think she's dealt with a lot of crap that's been thrown at her all her life and has come out of it relatively honorably. But at least she strikes me. The very reason people criticize her from the Sanders viewpoint is that she's changed her mind. And that's exactly what I want to see in Sanders, that he's capable of changing his mind.
Is there any other politician on the current scene, either domestically or internationally, who you would point to this 10-year-old grandchild and say, I admire, I mean, the way Nelson Mandela might have been 20 years ago?
You said in this country or
abroad, yeah.
Or broadly? Well, I think, like a lot of other people in my area of interest, I do wonder how both our parties aren't producing the kinds of leaders that can generally be admirable. We could have done better, it seems to me, this time around. I guess, in terms of public life generally, I'm very impressed by some of the people on the U.S. Supreme Court. Sotomayor, I think, has turned out to be a phenomenally good judge and a good voice. She's someone, given her struggles in her life and what she's turned into and so on, that I just think is enormously admirable, but people in the U.S. Supreme Court don't run for president.
Yeah, I think it went the other way, right? William Howard Taft.
Right.
How about on the international scene?
Well, if I cited my neighbor growing up in Philadelphia, Benjamin Netanyahu, you wouldn't believe me, so I won't even go there. But he is a product of Cheltenham High School, which is right outside Philadelphia, about 8 blocks from where I grew up. And the global scene. I'd need a lot more time to think it through.
Yeah, I mean, I think.
And what do you think?
Well, I usually say, when I ask myself that question, nobody else has asked me, Angela Merkel.
Yeah, that's
both because of her biography, which is amazing, but she built up. I mean, here is my own way of thinking about things. It's great to build up capital, but at a certain point you need to use it. And I think she's used the capital, which people, may have been critical for her. She didn't tip her hand on many issues. But I do admire her. I admire Pope Francis, and I would say that even if we weren't at a Jesuit institution. And it's interesting.
Well, Bernie's going to teach him about economics.
Yeah, it's interesting that when we look at young people and whom they admire, over the last 20, 30 years, it's Pope John Paul, it's Francis, it's the Dalai Lama. I think there's a feeling of authenticity, which even the people who are most cynical, they haven't lost the whole desire for authenticity. I write a lot about truth, and of course there's nothing that's more at risk nowadays than truth in the era of truthiness. Nonetheless, when your opponent says something which is not true, you jump right on them, showing that you haven't lost that impulse entirely. So I'm going to ask you one more question and then happily open it up. And I guess since you said I could ask any question, we should let people ask what's on their mind. So I ask you who you read as a student and who you emulated. This is, I think this comes out of the media that people in this room read. The ideal dinner party, historically, if you could have the dinner party with any figures from history.
You're not really going to ask him that.
You don't have to. You can take any amendment you want. But I guess I do a lot of interviewing. I guess is what leaps to mind. That's the question I ask. Any?
What, who I should invite?
Yeah, a dinner party. You'd be a fly on the wall.
Do I have to first check about who's lactose intolerant and who's vegetarian? And, maybe you haven't had too many dinner parties, but you try to put together a dinner party these days.
These people have no stomachs. You can serve anything.
I guess I'm going to take a pass.
Okay.
But I'll let anybody else, or, you probably thought it through better.
Well, I'll give a couple of quick answers.
You tell me, and then I'll tell you whether you're right or wrong.
Now, I wrote a book about highly creative people who lived a century ago, and people like Picasso and T.S. Eliot and Einstein. But the person who I actually would have most liked to have dinner with was someone who would not have had any use for me at all, and that was Igor Stravinsky. Not only because his music is so fantastic, but because he had a very interesting mind. I've also become a fan of Sarah Bakewell. Many of you will know she wrote this book about Montaigne, and I've just finished her new book about the existentialist cafe.
I finished it last night. I can't believe you're saying this. I have it right on my Kindle. I finished it last night.
And my next one is Americans in the Spanish Civil War. I found the book interesting, and what somebody said very interesting, that the people turned out to be as interesting as the ideas. And living in France before, during, and after the war, it struck me as being a very intellectually fertile time. And even the people who one would loathe, like Heidegger, it's amazing to think of what his life was like. Yeah. Floor's open. Okay. There was probably a mic that's making its way to you.
He is a Michael.
As preparation, I want to acknowledge an area of prowess that Alan has. I don't think most of the people in this room know about. And he hasn't written about it either. He's an outstanding tennis player. Alan, what
But
books,
you're left-handed, so you got an advantage.
what books are on your nightstand table that you expect to get to?
Well, we just heard. I literally just finished last night this book about apricot brandy and the what was the subtitle? Heidegger, existentialism, and apricot brandy, or something like that. But it's just purely by coincidence. I'll tell you that another thing I was asked to do this year by the National Endowment for the Humanities was to serve on a review panel for proposals from academics who want to write books for the general public. And they have to submit a proposal as well as a letter of intent to publish from a major publisher and so on. And so I got to read, from people I've never heard of, some incredibly interesting things. One of them, in fact, overlapped. Enid, my partner here, and I are going to go this summer to Switzerland. And one of the things we're going to do is take hikes along the paths that Friedrich Nietzsche took as he gradually went increasingly insane. And literally, there's a book proposal from someone who wants to go to Switzerland, stay in exactly the same hotel that we're going to stay in. We already have our reservation. And walk Nietzsche's walks and write about it. It's like, I loved the proposal. I compared it to Robert Pirsig's book on Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. But it was really encouraging to see all these academics trying to write what looked like really interesting books, fascinating books. And this Sarah Bakewell, she's not an academic. She's I guess, like you, a freelance writer, whatever you want to call it, independent scholar. But it was just an absolutely terrific one. And I have a very, very, I've done this all my life. Anybody can analyze it, tell me what you think, I don't care. But I divide my day up very, very rigorously into different kinds of reading material. So academic books I read only between 9 and 12 in the morning. When I come back to read after doing something like in late afternoon, early evening, I read popular history or biography. And then when I go to bed, I read novels. And we're talking 5 decades, of following this. So the nice thing about this book about Beauvoir and Sartre and Merleau-Ponty and all of these great thinkers was it could pass either as a sort of biography or...
So you read it all day, right? Actually, I think an interesting thing from your book on intellectual and public is your discussion of what it means to write a book essay, an essay about books. Do you want to say a bit about that? Because people may find that interesting.
You mean like multiple books?
Yeah, right.
One essay about, well, that...
And it was kind of like your thing.
Yeah, that's how I don't know how that became my thing, but being reviewing 5 or 6 books that revolve around a certain topic, and then trying to give each book its kind of proper weight and evaluation, but search for the larger picture that they all embody. Most people identify that with the New York Review of Books. I can't tell you how many people have told me how much they loved that thing I wrote in the New York Review of Books the other day. I have never written a thing, ever, at any time in my entire life in the New York Review of Books. New York Review of Books has its wonderful editor, Bob Silvers, and he has a particular sense of who he wants to publish and who he doesn't. I once agreed to give a talk. It was actually in Vienna, and Bob Silvers was the person who was going to moderate the talk, and I kept waiting, for the phone call or the email. I need information that I can put into my introduction. I never received a thing. I go there, he stands up, he gives the most beautiful, moving introduction of me, one of the most beautiful. He knows so much about it. Never written for him. Absolutely never written for him. So the New Republic became the home for me of that kind of book. Leon Wieseltier, with whom I've had a long and torturous and complicated relationship that at the moment involves about 5 years of not speaking to each other or mentioning each other's name in public, which I just violated because 5 years later I feel I can finally do it. He was, he would do that. I first started, I was on the editorial board of The Nation, which is more on the left, and given all that changes that went on, they had a writer named Alexander Coburn who had come out of a pretty anti-Semitic family and wrote in a way that I just personally couldn't stomach, and so I decided to resign from that. And then I had no magazine, and I come to my office one day, and there's 6 books. And it's a note from Leon, who I'd never met in my life, saying, would you review these for the New Republic? And I was thrilled. And I read they were all about pornography. Now, I have no idea what secrets he knew about me, but there I am writing about pornography. And I wrote it, and he said, this is exactly the New Republic kind of style. So, somehow I got into that. Again, I never particularly planned to. An opportunity arose, and I grew to love it. In terms of some of the themes we talked about earlier, I don't know of a single publication that does that anymore, at least in the way it was done under Leon's leadership back then. Maybe it can come to life again. When the New Republic was bought by this young hedge fund? Chris Hughes. And the old staff was all fired. I couldn't be fired because they had already thrown me off the masthead. So I was one of the few people not fired in that purge. So most of my friends all said, well, we're going to boycott this young guy and we're never going to write there again. I've actually started writing for them again.
Now he's thrown the towel in.
Yeah, right.
Didn't last
so maybe the online thing could encourage longer things. I think there are trends, John, aren't there trends toward longer things that I probably aren't aware of? Yeah.
Talking about things I'd like to read by Alan Wolfe, I've written a couple of essays which will never be published, or at least not while I'm alive, about things which I know a lot about and I wanted to get done before I passed. An essay by you on your relationships with editors, which would include Wieseltier and Silvers, for whom many of us have had similar kind of experience. I've always felt having a British accent would probably be a distinct help. But,
English people just sound smarter.
And you actually talked about here about your editor who helped you with this book, but you'd also worked with him at other places before. This is an important part of those of us who live by writing words, is our relationships to editors. Other questions? Yes, Susan, and then...
Don't you think the term independent scholar, which you both used and was used on our panel this morning, bespeaks something about what's wrong with our intellectual life today? I mean, no one calls people who work for universities dependent scholars. Mm-hmm. In effect, the term independent scholar seems to me ought to be applied to everyone. It's basically identifying scholarship by its source of financial support.
Yep. You're absolutely right. As soon as you started to talk, I said,
It's interesting
I know
that,
where this
it's
is
interesting that we
Yeah.
all use it, though.
going.
Yeah, please.
Thank you. This is wonderful. Thank you. And I have a question about, it might relate it to the fact that both of you haven't written about music. And it's a question about the way you spoke, really powerfully about the STEMmies and the way in which humanities differ from that whole genre of thinking and inquiry and trial and error. The question is about the ways in which the arts actually handle contradiction and complexity and ambiguity differently, not only than the hard sciences, but also perhaps from intellectual thought and philosophy and sometimes political discourse, right? Is there something about the way in which art forms and other forms of expression that may not lend themselves to your writing, actually both of you, in terms of music, actually do a different kind of job and a more effective job at handling contradiction and complexity in today's world, or in life in general?
Why don't you start?
Okay, well, I think that it's not helpful to lump all the arts together because, Brecht was an artist, but he clearly had ideas that he wanted to convey, and he was just finding a powerful way to do it. But to go back to the panel this morning, he actually wanted people to act. This wasn't just that you sit there and you learn about the 30-year war and then you go back to eating your matzah. Right? So I think some arts have a propositional undercurrent, but Brecht didn't simply write public intellectual monographs because he rightly perceived getting his ideas across would work more effectively in a dramatic context. Tony Kushner is another person. He really wants to change people's minds, and he's very powerful, but I think he's right. He's better doing it through Angels in America than through the New Republic. Mm-hmm. But when you talk about contradictions and things like that, we can only talk about that in the arts in a metaphoric way. Was Wagner doing contradiction? We could have a long argument about that, but that's not. In his verbal writings, he may have been but not in his musical ones. So I would, and what would contradiction mean in abstract expressionism, or indeed in a Velázquez painting? So I think we need to talk about those things where we can be fairly literal, where things are propositional, in a different way where things which are inherently metaphoric and people can take away. I can't say that you're right or wrong about a Picasso painting. Yeah, you might be right or wrong about what Brecht was trying to convey in one of his plays.
I guess when you start thinking about retirement, it sort of automatically comes to mind that you should pay homage to people in the past that have an influence on you, and some of Howard's questions were in that mode. So let me talk about someone who had a big impact on me, who's been almost all but forgotten in the discipline that I once taught, the discipline of sociology. Unlike the people we were talking about before, who were at one point described as neoconservatives, this person who taught at the University of California at Riverside was a genuine conservative.
Nisbet. Right?
Robert Nisbet. Robert Nisbet. He's really had an enormous impact for a time, and then, your star fades. But one of the books he wrote was called Sociology as an Art Form. And that really answers your question out for me, that I was attracted to the social sciences, which have now increasingly come to resemble the hard sciences, because I saw it as an art form. Some of the dominant people that had an impact on me were artists. Irving Goffman, who was the most brilliant sociologist of his generation, was an artist and not a social scientist. It was that kind of, or Herbert Gans, or Clifford Geertz. So there were just a whole number of really outstanding social scientists whose skill lay in portraits, in making portraits. Portraits of a village, as was the case with Gans, or portrait of a factory and so on. That's, I think, in danger of being forgotten. But for me, it is more of an art than a science.
Or it's more the lot of the independent scholar.
Yeah.
Because you will not get tenure for it. Bob Putnam, did you have a question? Or?
Yes, I'd like to ask, we've been talking a lot about the intellectual part of it, of public intellectual, but I'd like to ask about the public part of public intellectual. That is, what publics do you have in mind when you're writing, and what publics don't you have in mind? There are actually a lot of different kinds of publics. There's the public that is represented in the readership of the New Republic. That's certainly not the only republic in America. I mean, only public in America. There's the publics that are represented in Peoria or in places other than the intellectual parts of the two coasts. Another way of thinking about the public is the public you spoke to at Camp David when you were talking to both the Clintons about, reflectively, about how your work should or might influence what the president
You were
said.
there, and Bill.
Yeah, there were
Bill
three of us there, but I'm talking about your role there, because you were actually reflecting as an intellectual things that you thought, and that eventually he thought, should be reflected in his State of the Union message. So that's a different kind of public. That's influencing public affairs. And then I'm trying to get the word public intellectual to mean something other than not academic, professional academics. And what else is it substantively besides it's not the APSA? Is the question clear?
Yeah. This is Robert Putnam from Harvard, author of Bowling Alone and a number of other really important books that have helped shape our public conversation. Well, when Bill Galston was working in the White House, he had this idea of gathering some intellectuals to sit around with the president, President Clinton and his wife. And before you know it, we were all being driven out to Camp David. And we spent a whole day there, not only with the president and the First Lady, but with the Vice President, Al Gore, and Stephanopoulos, and what's his name from California, the Defense Secretary. Yeah, Leon Panetta. How quickly fame. Bob, that was simply the most singular, unusual experience I've ever had. It was like, being told, I lack words for describing it. This is what you dream about when you're in the business of writing, to have these people as your audience and to talk directly to them with, as it turned out, due to Bill Galston's genius, other intellectuals that you deeply admire and respect. And maybe that's the way it is on Mount Olympus. I kept sort of thinking, I don't know what your reaction was, but mine was, this is never going to happen to me again. I better make good use of all my time while I'm here. But that's so unusual. I mean, I don't usually think that way about who's going to read me. And in fact, I actually, public intellectual, I didn't invent it. It's applied to me. I guess I don't mind being called that. Other people do mind. I don't have a specific public in mind. I just want to write. And, I do imagine that there's what we might have called the New Republic readership. And that would be certainly other academics, but also people with some kind of connections in Washington. But we touched on this briefly in the morning. The minute you start thinking about who your audience is, you're letting this conception of a potential audience shape what you're writing. And in that sense, you're no longer independent. And I tried as best as I could. You can't obviously do this perfectly or even relatively well, of trying not to think about the audience that I'm writing for. Now, some things, like I'm sure you're asked to address a specific group or a specific, then you have to have them in mind. You're writing this for public school principals or whatever. But I don't know if you have thoughts on that as well, since you've got a large readership. Mm-hmm.
I'll come to the person behind Bill and then Bill in a moment.
Over here we got one too.
Yeah, but let me just say that I think one of the most pernicious trends in contemporary life is looking at, how many times, you're liked on a social network site, or how many times you're mentioned, because for so many people, this becomes the definition of your influence. And if you don't have a lot of that, then nobody pays any attention. When I think about public, I don't think about the people who would usually read me because they're in the field. I think about people who are not in my field, but who are thoughtful and will comment on it. And I don't care if it's thousands. I'd rather have 20 that I can learn something from, but that's not, and I think that would be much more, in the days of the partisan review, they weren't doing counts, but, people who were thoughtful would read it. Yes, so
can I just,
yeah, please.
one more comment?
Sure.
And then Kathy, but when I look back on my life, I think about my incredibly near-perfect timing. I arranged to be born in 1942, just as World War II was beginning, but just after the Great Depression had, come to an end. And now I end my career just as Twitter and Facebook and all these other things that I have no relationship to whatsoever. And I'm not saying that for, reverse status are coming into being. I just don't know how I could possibly enter the business. I'm in the business of words in the era of Twitter. I just don't know how. Anyway. Kathy.
We were talking a little bit about how the STEM disciplines and the sciences don't have a great tolerance for ambiguity or nuance. In some sense, they want clear answers. Isn't there an area, though, in the humanistic disciplines that seems to be looking for this? And I'm thinking of our approach to the past, our approach to history. We see Princeton not sure whether it wants to keep Woodrow Wilson's name on the School of Public Service. Yale is looking at whether it should take Calhoun College off the books because Calhoun owned slaves. Harvard is just redoing its seal for the law school because the person who gave the money and whose seal it represents also owned slaves. I was wondering if you could say, both of you say something about how you think we should, as intellectuals, as scholars, as teachers, appropriate history in such a fashion that recognizes the mistakes of the past, but at the same time doesn't totally eradicate the history of the flawed men and women that have brought us to where we are, and as we are also flawed.
Well, I agree with you, even though you didn't answer the question directly. If I were Princeton, I would keep it Woodrow Wilson. I think they decided to. But I'd leave a space in the hallway where you talk about Wilson in a more rounded way than they would have in 1950, whenever the school started. But I think to airbrush is to become a communist state.
It has that aspect to me, too. I also think it defines people in the past by only one thing about them. For example, I'm, as a political theorist, to the extent I am, I think of John C. Calhoun as one of the greatest writers about politics this country has ever produced. Wrong-headed, but thoughtful, brilliant, and so on. And to just say, well, Calhoun owned slaves, and that's the end of who Calhoun was. Just, I don't know. So I'd rather keep them and talk about it. Use them as learning opportunities, as we say.
Bill, did you have a? Oh.
Well,
we'll get to you, Rich.
Yep.
I promise.
First of all, just on that point, and I actually have a question. First of all, as a practical matter, I think that answer is absolutely the right one. Right? You retain the name and take on board the ambiguous legacy and use it as a vehicle for discussion rather than sending the history down the memory hole. The question of the relationship between the part and the whole in the case of someone like Calhoun, I think is not simple. Take an analogous case, Heidegger. Okay? On the one hand, I certainly want to say we should continue to read Heidegger.
On the other hand, learning what we've learned about who he was makes us read Heidegger differently. And I think we would be blinding ourselves. I mean, when I read Being in Time now, there's a certain resonance there. The critique of urban life and the bourgeoisie and idle chatter and all of that. Those are not metaphysical statements anymore. Those are political statements that infused his more philosophical views. But here's my question. You and I are almost of an age. We've both lived through a remarkable period of American history. I grew up in a household where The Nation was the right-wing magazine. But I've always, as from a young adult on, I've always sort of been what I am now. And I'm not saying that to boast, it's just a fact. That's not true for you. Right? As you said, you have moved from one position on the political spectrum to a distinctively different position. Talk about that a little bit. What catalyzed that movement?
Well, let me say, it's not the kind of movement that you see from people who go from one extreme to the other.
Not Arthur Koestler.
It's not Arthur Koestler. It's not David Horowitz. David Horowitz, for those of you who don't know, is someone of our age who went from being an extremely important theorist of European and American Marxism to being way out there on the far right. He actually went through his transition in a study group that I was also in out in Berkeley, and Todd Gitlin was in the same group. There were a few of us there, and I watched him go through that transformation, and it was really torturous. Maybe that was the reason why when he called everything he did the Second Thoughts Conference. He held a number of them. I had second thoughts about my New Left attractions, but they never turned into that. Now, it was on the way to doing that. I distinctly remember a period where people started calling me a neoconservative. But something stopped me right where we're, I consider myself slightly to the left of you, but not more, than that much. So that to me is the more interesting question. In the New Republic, I just wrote about a new book by a man named Daniel Oppenheimer, whose brother Mark was our visiting professor here at BC in Jewish-Christian relations last year. And this was a book about Horowitz and Whittaker Chambers and the others who made that transformation. And one of the questions I asked in the review is, what makes these people so certain? They're certain when they're on the left, they're certain when they're on the right. How do they know that they're going to stay on the right if they've already made this shift? Now, I think they probably are, but I wonder how they know.
That's exactly the answer I would give. I think there are the true believers, that's Eric Hoffer's term,
Right.
but there are people who are naturally contrarian, and you're one of them. Anything that somebody says, you right away think about ways in which you might not agree, and that's a healthy...
Is that right?
I'm speaking totally professionally.
Can we just call him Rich Mao?
I've got a question about the role of the academy in forming public intellectuals within its midst, in its own ranks. There, in a lot of academic contexts, people who are most down on public intellectuals are colleagues of public intellectuals. It's not the kind of thing that you often get points for tenure in doing. On the other hand, as you know, there were programs a couple of years ago, people starting a PhD program and being a public intellectual. And I want to ask you, in sort of personal terms, so your grandchild says, Grandpa, when I grow up, I want to be like you.
Good luck.
What would you recommend as a way of becoming a public intellectual?
I actually get asked that question a lot by older people, like Harvard PhD students who don't want to go into, whatever you want to call it, the conventional way of doing social science. And I don't know. How will I ever get tenure, is the question that they always want to have an answer to. And I can only answer by saying, is tenure really your objective? Because if it is your objective, you probably shouldn't do this. And if your objective is to lead a life that you feel good about and feel accomplishment, then tenure will either come or it won't come. Well, why rule it out in advance? So I don't know. A couple of people I can think of have followed that advice and actually wound up tenured, and a couple of others didn't. But the other thing I noticed in thinking about all of this is that there is a place for public intellectuals in the university. It just does not happen to be in colleges of arts and sciences. It happens to be in professional schools, in business schools, education schools, divinity schools. I shouldn't have to tell you, about divinity schools. There I find some of the best, in this, I actually wound up writing a little paper for the National Endowment for the Humanities on this question, and I cite this book that was written, I think it was in 1968, by David Reisman and Christopher Jenks, called The Academic Revolution, which really sort of predicted all of this. And I mentioned in passing that Jenks and Reisman today both would find themselves somewhat marginalized from the arts and sciences disciplines, because it's really been the kind of graduate school emphasis at many of our top universities that it has come to define. PhD program, professional schools don't have that problem. They're not turning out those kinds of PhDs. There's much more room intellectually to breathe in all of our professional schools.
Yeah, I would just add one other thing. I'm not known for saying nice things about Lawrence H. Summers, the departed president of Harvard, but he actually believed that part of his job was to bring in public intellectuals. And I think the more general point is, if the presidents and the trustees want to have them on the campuses, they will. But you can't mandate that.
I've also found much more support for my work from top-level administrators, presidents and provosts, not only here but everywhere, than from departments in the College of Arts and Sciences.
There are a couple of hands back there.
Francis?
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, Francis got it.
Yeah, okay.
One of my tennis players. I got a lot of my tennis players are spotted throughout here.
Thank you. First, I'm going to follow Alan's contrarian nature and say that the question of whether one retains the name of an institution despite the not fully positive nature of a grantee or a donor is a very difficult question. If we had an institution named the Idi Amin University or the Pol Pot Chapel, we might not retain that. And I'm not, and now I'm being outrageous, of course, because that's so extreme as to be easy. But it's a difficult question and not one readily resolved in the manner of saying, well, we should retain the history and then have an asterisk next to it. But to my question, and I love Alan except for when his backhand's on, because he beats me all the time then in tennis. So we have great time on the tennis court. I want to follow up on one of the comments about the public portion of intellectual. I'm not an academician nor an intellectual, but I want to ask, your role sort of is to opine. You do this brilliantly through your books. You're read because you have a sterling reputation, and you're read by people whose opinions, in a way, matter to you. I guess my question is, do you wish that you had a wider following in the sense of having a bigger impact on a broader audience? And secondly, is there any relationship to what I might say could be seen as opinion influencers like, David Brooks in the New York Times, who has only 500 words to make a point, and try to do it so thoughtfully, though, that it influences the public sphere of thinking or discussion.
Thank you. Well, I guess I should first say that probably like all the young boys I grew up with in Philadelphia in the 1940s, if you asked me, would I like to be best remembered for my scholarship? Would I like to be best remembered for my personal life? Would I like to be best remembered for my students? No, it's for my backhand. So, thank you.
That's a backhanded compliment.
Well, that's a great question. If you're in this business, you are going to notice that certain people, get a lot more publicity for their writing than I might, get to appear in a certain world. And I don't really have an honest answer. I'd like to say no, if Oprah invited me to her show, I wouldn't want to have any. I can't say that. I think we do crave attention. And there are people that would get a lot more attention than I would, and I could very well be jealous of them, and probably am. On the other hand, overall and so on, I really have no complaints. I have reached people, and sometimes the emails you get, can literally make your day from people who, and I do get those. I read the last book on the diaspora, and it just explained my whole life to me. I mean, sometimes you get a little scared, and maybe you should write to your therapist and not to me. But, if you get, as in tennis, there always will be people better than you. And you just have to accept that.
Well, Alan was smart enough not to include an index in his book, The Intellectual in Public. But therefore, you don't know, Francis, that he actually discovered David Brooks.
Yeah,
because you were writing about David Brooks long before we all knew who he was. So
I thank you. I forgot. I was going to mention it. I go back a long way with David, and well, I'll just tell one story. We were all at a conference together many, many years ago, and we broke for dinner, and we were sitting around the table, and David said, "Excuse me," and he went, to what could be thought of as a extensive bathroom break. And he came back and I said, "So did you write your column for tomorrow's paper?" And he said, "Yes." But I don't want to, I really like him, actually. We were, at one point in our lives, there was a late person who had been a Lutheran pastor who had become a Catholic priest and had a magazine called First Things, Richard Newhouse, and he once wrote an article warning David and me about writing about Christians and saying Jews who write about Christians, should watch their place or something like that. And so I was honored to be lumped together with.
Yeah, one more quick question. Let's take it all the way in the back. Yeah. Yes.
That's Susan again.
Oh no, I actually was pointing to someone else.
I'll put this in the form of a question. Were you not excessively kind, Alan, in terms of intellectual charity, not to point out that the reason for Mr. Brooks and other people getting more attention than you has nothing to do with them as individuals, but with the power of the institution they write for you? They write for.
Can we get the woman next to last question?
That's Kyle. Kyle, you.
Okay. Well, so I have two questions. As a student of Professor Wolfe's at the Boisi Center, where do you think the line is drawn for what makes someone a public intellectual? Because as a student, I would say that my teachers are public figures and that they come into interaction with classes between 15 and 200. And then my second question is, do you think, I'm a student of philosophy here, that philosophy is important? I mean, we've heard talk about Heidegger, you two both just finished a book on existentialism. Do you think that philosophy is important to being a public intellectual?
Well, Kyle, thank you, because you actually made a very good point, which I would rephrase as that every academic, whether they consider themselves a public intellectual or not, is a public intellectual in the classroom. That's just such an important part of what we do. And if you can't talk to a general public in a comprehensible way, then you're a lousy teacher. And teaching is such an enormous part of what, to the degree I'm a public intellectual, teaching, I can't tell you how many article ideas or book ideas just emerge in the middle of a class, and I sort of, wait for it then so I can write it down and then turn it into something. That's a huge part of what we do, especially people like me who really only want to teach undergraduates and don't feel competent to teach graduate students and really wouldn't know what to do if anything. My one graduate student here. No. Annette, oh, there you are. You didn't hear that. You didn't hear that. Finish that thesis. And what was the rest? What was? Philosophy. Oh, philosophy. Do you want to?
I've just written, so I will say it publicly. I think the one subject everybody should study in college is philosophy.
Yeah.
Can you join me in thanking a great public intellectual?
Oh, look at that. Thank you. You're also nice. I have a very contrarian theory about standing after a theatrical or operatic performance, but I won't tell you now what it is because it would be in very bad taste. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, and thank you especially, Howard Gardner, for this terrific exchange. This has been such a pleasure, and it's a wonderful transition, a wrap-up of our morning academic session and a lead-in to a more Boisi Center-centric and also a personal opportunity for Alan to make some remarks as well. I hope you'll come with us to the Boisi Center and eat, drink, and be merry for an hour or so, or 45 minutes until about 3 o'clock, at which time we'll have a program where Jeff Boisi and Alan and myself and others will have a few minutes to say a few marks of appreciation as well.